there is a history, George Soros, right? Like there is a tendency or a history, if you choose to look for it, of people who've come from great wealth and have a sense of giving back to a society that has put them in a very fortunate place.
Well, those things play out for the elite sphere, right? Like people who are on the extreme fringes or have a lot of influence.
Yes.
Would we agree that there's a general kind of political leanings between people who are middle class, leaning a little bit more conservative, and then people who work having more economically progressive politics? That not at the extreme levels, but in just a kind of general class divide for most people who work in, salaried middle management positions versus working class.
Yeah, I'd say you're probably right there. I mean, because it's
not a lot of those people happen to vote also. They don't necessarily have as much political influence.
Middle-class people, by definition, have the most investment in the status quo. They have the greatest investment in the existing social order because they've benefited from it. But also, middle-class people are defined by a sense of anxiety, right? Like they very much fear slipping down a peg on the system. And so it's very easy to mobilize middle-class people to, to sort of fear threatening forces, particularly sort of like left-wing threatening forces. Like middle-class people are never going to be
anti-communism.
Yeah, exactly, right? And this is why, in a way that like very sort of poor or working class people, I think, can be more easily mobilized towards true left-wing politics. And this is something that I think is infinitely sort of frustrating to leftist sort of agitators in comfortably middle-class societies, because they often sort of choose to imagine that, what are often just kind of like, again, somewhat slightly downwardly mobile middle-class people as somehow being like poor people, right? Whereas when you see like true kind of like mass mobilization of like leftist politics, it tends to happen in countries where there is like a large, like really true working class, downwardly mobile working class, poverty, sort of sustenance level working class kind of people. Countries in the global south, in Latin and South America, sort of places like that. And you just don't see that kind of cohort that it seems who doesn't have enough personal investment in kind of the social order to feel any sort of reverence towards it.
They don't have any slice of the pie.
Yeah,
not
exactly.
Even a
And so
small
in
one.
that sense, it's easy to vote for, Hugo Chavez or whatever, because, tearing down the social order doesn't sound that bad. Whereas I think that in a strongly middle-class society, you're much more likely to be at risk for like a kind of right-wing sort of reactionary government who in part promises to fight against the leftist radicals that could possibly destabilize the economic system and all the other things that make for your precarious but, comfortable life.
What if that stuff starts to happen in the U.S. though? Like by some of these projections, there's a quarter of the country is working for Amazon by 2040.
Yeah.
Wild projections. These things, we might be in unprecedented economic circumstances. Is there the possibility of that type of coalition emerging in the advanced world in either of our countries?
I just think that the economic situation would have to get a lot worse. Like I don't think it would have to be just like relatively stagnant economic growth. I think you'd have to have like a period of like prolonged recession of huge unemployment for a very long period of time, of people really being destitute enough to feel that they have no investment in the existing order anymore. And I just think that we're nowhere near that. I really do. And I think that I have faith that we're going to see economic growth and that we're going to sort of lift.
You do?
I think so. I'm not, maybe I'm just naive. Maybe I don't have a particularly well-developed sort of theory of where exactly
Good to be an optimist.
I'm trying to be optimistic. Like I do have a lot of faith in American innovation, and I think that's ultimately the engine that runs so much of this stuff. I think that there's, I come here to New York City, you still get a sense of hope and sort of American ingenuity and passion and pride and dynamism and all these good things, and you kind of have to feel like it's gonna lead somewhere. I mean, you can choose to be rationally optimistic, or you can choose to be rationally pessimistic. You can choose to view the glass half full or half empty. And I just feel like there's too much, things have swung too far to the way, in the direction where people are hungry for pessimism, and they view everything through the light of their own pessimism, and they sort of, the sort of stories that they amplify and share on social media are the most pessimistic ones, and then the ones that are positive are the ones that give us any sort of reason to be, hopeful about the future. Like those stories go into the more.
When you say economic growth, you're talking about like increasing GDP.
Yeah,
you're taking from a liberal democratic perspective. Like we have been post-war period, we had this boom, and since then, growth rates have been shrinking.
Yes.
What if that is not just we happen to have been in a slump? What if this is just part of capitalism?
Yeah.
That it's actually extremely expensive and prohibitive, and you industrialize up to a certain degree, and then shit just gets crazy expensive, and you can't actually recuperate those growth rates.
I don't know.
And the reason China can do it is because they can still industrialize. They have like a little bit further to go. But once you get up to a certain point, it's like that's the end of growth.
Yeah.
What if it's not possible?
Well, then I suppose we have to make do with less, don't we? I mean, and we'll have to adjust our lifestyles accordingly, and we'll have to scale things back a bit. It's kind of an upsetting possibility to have to consider if we have grown comfortable with thinking ourselves as living in a sort of culture of endless abundance and all that. But I mean, that's one path, certainly. And I mean, and I'm sensitive to it because I think that when you look back at the dynamic economic growth that we experienced in the post-war years, what the French call like the Magnificent 30, sort of 1945 to 1973 or something like that. Like there's a lot of variables in that are probably never going to be able to be replicable. There was just so much technological innovation that happened in that point. Nothing like what we've seen in the last 30 years, like in terms of all of the new sort of technologies and inventions and things that were made for the first time. Plastic and industrialization and televisions and like all of the sort of like the modern infrastructure of our modern life. That can only happen once. You can only invent the microwave once, right? Like you can only electrify everything once, right?
Yes.
And as well, like you can only get women into the workforce once, right? Like that's an understated aspect of post-war economic growth, is that just a ton of women were working for the first time. So you're like, increasing the workforce by however much, and that obviously drives up the GDP growth in a big way, right?
We also change the way in which we calculate productivity too. And it's extremely granular, but computational capacity, meaning how many teraflops per second our computers are able to calculate, that is now used to derive our productivity numbers for the last several years. And some of those things, I don't know, it seems like the people who work in computer jobs are doing a lot of like interesting software stuff, but I'm not necessarily sure that it's actually adding to productivity. I'm not sure a lot more stuff is getting made.
Yeah.
I really feel like it may not actually be recoverable, and that we may be in a permanent period of stagnation such that the declining circumstances of those people, that unstable middle class, is going to increasingly go for these strongman populist leaders. That's my fear. That's my analysis.
Well, I mean, it's a valid fear. And certainly when you have politicians like Trump who are sort of peddling sort of mythological solutions to economic stagnation, right? Like the idea that America is going to like sort of overnight become the great industrializing hub of the world, the great manufacturing hub of the world, right? Like that's dumb. Like that's obviously not going to happen. If there is a sort of great economic revival in America, it's not going to come through the manufacturing sector. I don't think anybody seriously buys into that, and it's certainly not going to come from a revival of manufacturing things like toasters, or like what J.D. Vance was saying the other day.
Toast our way to prosperity.
Well, I know it's like this was like literally he was bragging about this the other day. Like we're going to bring back the toaster making jobs to America. Like that kind of thing is not going to happen. So then you kind of have to ask, well, what is going to be the driver for